They say you do not just marry the man, you marry his entire family. But no one warned me that my fiancé's wealthy family had a dark tradition of psychologically destroying new spouses to protect their fragile egos. They invited me to an exclusive Chicago country club dinner to put me in my place. They spent 45 minutes tearing apart my background, dissecting my worth, and trying to force me to sign away my future. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in a room with the one person who had the exact skills to legally dismantle their entire fake empire. Then it was my turn to speak, and you could hear a pin drop. My name is Nadine, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic people who underestimated your intelligence. The private dining room at the Oak Ridge Country Club was freezing. Heavy mahogany doors shut us inside, insulating us from the polite chatter of the main restaurant. The air felt thick and suffocating, smelling of expensive steak and old money arrogance. I sat across from Patricia, my future mother-in-law, whose icy blue eyes tracked my every movement. Beside her sat my fiancé, Greg. He was swirling a glass of 18-year-old scotch, completely silent. I thought this dinner was to celebrate our upcoming wedding. Instead, it felt like an interrogation. Patricia reached into her designer leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. She did not say a word at first. She just placed her perfectly manicured hand on the folder and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of my plate. I looked down at the label. It had my full legal name printed in bold black ink. "I hired a private firm to look into your background, Nadine," Patricia said, taking a delicate sip of her sparkling water. "When a woman with your modest upbringing marries into a family like ours, we have to be absolutely certain there are no liabilities." My heart slammed against my ribs. I looked at Greg, expecting him to intervene, to act shocked or angry that his mother had secretly investigated me. But Greg did not even flinch. He just kept staring into his glass of scotch, avoiding my gaze entirely. Patricia opened the folder. "Let us review, shall we? You grew up in a very unremarkable suburb. Your father was a public school teacher and your mother managed a small retail store. It says here they nearly lost their home during the housing crash and had to dip into their retirement funds just to keep the lights on. How tragic." I felt my face grow hot. My parents worked tirelessly to provide for me, and their financial struggles were not a source of shame. They were victims of a predatory banking system, not lazy people. I opened my mouth to defend them, but before I could speak, I felt Greg place a heavy hand on my knee under the table. He squeezed it tightly, a silent command to stay quiet. "Just let her finish," Greg muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Know your place tonight, Nadine." The words felt like a physical slap across the face. Know my place. The man who had spent the last 3 years telling me I was his equal, the man who had begged me to marry him just 2 months ago, was now treating me like a misbehaving servant. The betrayal was immediate and sharp, cutting through all the love and trust I had built for him. Patricia smiled, a thin, cruel smile that did not reach her eyes. She turned the page of her report. It continues. "You attended a state university. Very average grades. You drive a 5-year-old sedan. You have a modest savings account. By all accounts, Nadine, you bring absolutely nothing of value to this family. You have no pedigree, no connections, and certainly no wealth. In fact, you represent a significant risk." They paraded around Chicago like they were royalty, hiding behind their memberships and leased luxury cars. I looked across the table and caught the eye of Jasmine. She was the wife of Greg's older brother, Lance. Jasmine was a brilliant black African-American woman who used to run a highly successful architecture firm. Now she sat there completely silent, her hands shaking as she gripped her linen napkin. Her spirit had been crushed by this exact same psychological torture 5 years ago. I saw the pure terror in her eyes. I took a deep breath. I did not cry. I did not run out of the room. I just stared right back at Patricia, waiting for the real trap to be sprung. The night was far from over, and I was ready for whatever they were about to throw at me. Lance leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. He flashed a smile that was entirely teeth, lacking any real warmth. "You have to understand, Nadine," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "We are not just talking about your lack of trust funds or property. We are talking about an entire mindset. I saw you pull up in that beaten-down Toyota tonight." The valet looked like he wanted to sanitize his hands after parking it. "When you represent this family, you cannot be seen living like someone one missed paycheck away from eviction." I felt my jaw tighten. "My car is paid off, Lance," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I prefer not to carry unnecessary debt." Before I could say another word, Greg's hand clamped down harder on my knee. His fingers dug into my skin painfully. "Just let them finish," he whispered harshly, his breath warm against my ear. "Know your place, Nadine. Do not talk back to my brother." I froze. The man sitting next to me was a complete stranger. This was not the Greg who brought me coffee in bed, or talked about adopting rescue dogs. This was the real Greg, the one his family had carefully engineered. I looked across the table again, and my eyes locked onto Jasmine. Jasmine was staring intently at her plate, but her shoulders were rigid. Her hands were gripping the white linen napkin so tightly, her knuckles had turned completely pale. Lance snapped his fingers in her direction, without even looking at her. "Jasmine, pour me more wine," he barked. Jasmine jolted as if she had been struck. She immediately reached for the heavy crystal decanter, her hands trembling so badly the glass clinked loudly against Lance's wineglass as she poured. She did not say a word. She just filled his glass and shrank back into her chair, making herself as small as possible. The message was loud and clear. 5 years ago, Jasmine was a fierce, independent architect running her own successful firm. Now she was a silent, obedient shadow, serving drinks on command. They had systematically broken her down, and tonight it was my turn. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. The polite hum of the main restaurant briefly drifted in before the doors clicked shut again. A tall, older man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit walked into the room. He carried a thick leather briefcase. I recognized him instantly from my background research. He was Mr. Harrison, the ruthless corporate attorney who handled all the legal affairs for the family trust. Mr. Harrison did not offer a greeting. He simply walked straight to the head of the table, unclasped his briefcase, and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. He dropped the thick bundle directly onto my dinner plate, right over my untouched steak. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. Patricia folded her hands elegantly, resting her chin on them. "We are a family built on legacy, Nadine," she announced, her voice echoing with twisted pride. "We have a family tradition. Every spouse who enters this circle must prove they are here for love and not for our wealth. We have spent generations building our empire, and we do not let outsiders compromise it. If you truly love my son, you will sign this prenuptial agreement without hesitation." I stared down at the document. It was easily 60 pages long. It was not a standard prenuptial agreement designed to protect premarital assets. It was a financial execution. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and began reciting the key clauses aloud in a dry, monotone voice, as if he were reading a grocery list. "Section 4 stipulates that you will surrender any future earnings from your career into the family trust. Section 7 mandates that your current personal savings will be transferred to an account managed by Patricia and Lance. Section 12 states that in the event of a divorce resulting from infidelity on Greg's part, you will walk away with zero financial compensation and waive all rights to alimony." My mind raced. The absurdity of the document was staggering. They were not asking me to protect their assets. They were legally mandating that I hand over every single thing I owned and everything I would ever earn. They wanted me entirely financially dependent on them, trapped with no escape route, just like Jasmine. I looked at Greg. A part of me still foolishly hoped he would stop this. I waited for him to snatch the document away to tell his mother and brother that this was insane and that he would not let them treat his future wife this way. Instead, Greg smiled softly. It was a chilling, condescending smile. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He uncapped it slowly and placed it right on top of the legal documents in front of me. "It is just a formality, baby," Greg said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "We have a legacy to protect. My family requires sacrifices from the lower class to ensure the bloodline remains secure. If you love me, you will not make a big deal out of this. You do not need your own money anyway. I will take care of you." I looked from the gold pen to Greg and then to Patricia, who was watching me like a hawk waiting for its prey to bleed out. They really thought I was just some naive, middle-class accountant who would be intimidated by their wealth and their expensive lawyer. They thought they had cornered a helpless victim who would sign away her life just for the privilege of carrying their last name. I did not touch the pen. I leaned back in my chair and let a slow, deliberate silence fill the freezing room. "Let us get one thing straight," I said, breaking the tension. "My career is not a hobby I will be surrendering to your trust fund." Greg's smile vanished instantly. He leaned in closer, his tone turning aggressive. "Are you really going to ruin our future over money, Nadine? I thought you were different. I thought you were not a gold digger." Lance scoffed loudly, taking a long sip of his wine. "Told you, Greg, you cannot bring a stray dog into the house and expect it not to beg for scraps at the table. She is just like the rest of them." Jasmine flinched at Lance's words, her eyes darting toward the exit like a trapped animal. I felt a surge of white-hot anger, but I kept my face perfectly, completely still. Emotion was what they fed on, and I refused to give them a single drop. "Sign the document," Nadine Patricia ordered, her voice dropping its fake sweetness and turning into a cold, hard command. "Or you can walk out that door right now. But if you walk out, Greg cancels the wedding, and we will make sure you are blacklisted from every accounting firm in Chicago. We have friends on the board of every major financial institution in this city. You will never work in this state again." The threat hung heavily in the air. They were trying to crush my livelihood just as they had crushed Jasmine's architecture firm. They wanted me to believe they were untouchable gods of the Chicago elite. I suddenly let my breathing become shallow and erratic. I brought a trembling hand to my chest, acting completely overwhelmed by the ultimatum. I reached for my water glass and intentionally knocked it over, sending ice water spilling across the mahogany table and onto the edges of the prenuptial agreement. "Oh my God," I gasped, my voice shaking. "I cannot breathe. I am having a panic attack." Patricia rolled her eyes in sheer disgust. "Good Lord," she muttered. "Jasmine, go to the restroom with her and make sure she does not do anything embarrassing in public. We do not need a scene. Get her cleaned up and bring her back here to sign." Jasmine quickly stood up, nodding frantically. She walked over to me, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "Come on," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let us go to the ladies' room." I let Jasmine lead me out of the freezing private dining room. As the heavy oak doors shut behind us, cutting off Lance's mocking laughter and Patricia's cold glare, the atmosphere shifted. We hurried down the long carpeted hallway toward the opulent marble restrooms. The moment the restroom door closed behind us, Jasmine collapsed against the wall. The silent, obedient wife act dropped instantly, and she completely broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at me with pure desperation. "You have to climb out the window, Nadine," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You have to run and never look back. They are not protecting wealth. They are vampires. They trap you. They steal your credit. They take everything you have built, and they bleed you dry to pay for their country club memberships and luxury cars." Jasmine reached into her designer leather purse, her hands shaking violently. She pulled out a small silver USB drive and shoved it into my hand. "I stole this from Lance's home office yesterday," she whispered, looking around as if Lance might appear from the bathroom stalls. "It has everything. The fake loans, the stolen credit accounts they opened in my name, the money they drained from my parents' retirement fund to cover their bad investments. Take it. Use it to save yourself. Just get away before they turn you into a ghost like me. I looked down at the silver USB drive resting in my palm. The piece of plastic was Jasmine's ultimate act of rebellion, her desperate attempt to save another woman from her fate. I looked back up at her reflection in the gilded mirror. My fake panic attack vanished entirely. My breathing steadied, my posture straightened, and I let out a calm, collected sigh. I reached out and gently placed the USB drive back into Jasmine's trembling hand. "I do not need it, Jasmine," I said, my voice steady and firm. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and unlocked it, opening a heavily encrypted folder on my home screen. I held it up for her to see. Jasmine stared at the screen, her eyes widening in confusion as she looked at the complex financial spreadsheets and offshore routing numbers. "I am not a corporate tax preparer, Jasmine," I explained quietly. "I am a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud and offshore tax evasion. I have been investigating the family trust for 6 months. I already have their entire financial history." Jasmine gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "Follow my lead," I told her, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. "Tonight we burn their fake empire to the ground, and you get your life back." Jasmine took a deep, shaky breath and nodded. She splashed some cold water on her face and patted it dry with a paper towel. We walked out of the restroom together and made our way back down the long carpeted hallway. As we approached the heavy oak doors of the private dining room, I could hear Lance's booming laugh echoing through the wood. They were celebrating. They thought they had already won. I pushed the doors open and walked back to the table with my head held high. Jasmine trailed slightly behind me, but this time her shoulders were not completely hunched. She took her seat next to Lance, who barely even glanced at her. Patricia looked at me with a smug, satisfied expression. She was leaning back in her chair, twirling the stem of her wine glass. "Feeling better, Nadine?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Panic attacks can be so terribly embarrassing, but we are willing to overlook it this once. Now let us get back to business. Mr. Harrison has another appointment to get to, and we are wasting his valuable time." Greg reached out and slid the thick 60-page prenuptial agreement closer to the center of my plate. He picked up the heavy gold fountain pen and held it out to me. His eyes were cold, devoid of any of the warmth I thought I had known for the past 3 years. "Just sign it, Nadine," he said firmly. "Let us put this ugly business behind us so we can enjoy our dinner. We have Wagyu beef getting cold." I did not take the pen from him. Instead, I reached out and pulled the thick stack of legal documents toward me. I flipped past the first few pages, ignoring the clauses about waiving alimony and surrendering my future earnings. I turned directly to page 42, the section detailing the asset disclosures of the family trust. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "I have a quick question about section 42, subsection C. It lists an entity called Apex Holdings, LLC, as a primary subsidiary of the family trust. Could you clarify the operational purpose of this holding company for me?" Mr. Harrison was in the middle of taking a sip of water. He stopped abruptly, his glass hovering an inch from his mouth. His gray eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "I beg your pardon," he said, setting the glass down. "That is standard corporate structuring language. It does not concern your obligations under this agreement." I flipped to the next page, running my finger down a list of shell companies. "Really?" I asked, looking up at him with a polite smile. "Because from what I am reading, Apex Holdings LLC is registered in Delaware, but operates exclusively out of a post office box in the Cayman Islands. Furthermore, it seems to be funneling capital directly into a venture capital fund called Project Obsidian, which is strange considering Project Obsidian has not reported any taxable revenue to the federal government in over 4 years. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Greg's hand slowly lowered to the table, the gold fountain pen slipping from his fingers and clattering against his plate. Patricia's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Lance stopped chewing his food, his jaw hanging slightly open. "What are you talking about?" Lance demanded, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier arrogant boom. "Stop stalling and sign the paper." I ignored Lance completely and kept my eyes locked on Mr. Harrison. The attorney was visibly sweating now. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a handkerchief, dabbing at his forehead. "Ms. Nadine," he stammered, adjusting his collar. "I am not sure how a local tax accountant is familiar with international corporate structuring, but you are severely misinterpreting these documents." "I am not misinterpreting anything, Mr. Harrison," I replied smoothly. "In fact, I am looking at a very clear pattern of offshore tax evasion, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. The money you took from Jasmine's architecture firm was not lost in a bad investment. It was wired through Apex Holdings, LLC, to cover the margin calls on Patricia's underwater real estate portfolio in Aspen." Patricia slammed both her hands flat onto the mahogany table. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her face turning a blotchy shade of red. "Who do you think you are speaking to? You are a nobody. You are a low-level number cruncher who balances spreadsheets for mom and pop stores." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I looked Patricia dead in the eyes. "I am not a local tax preparer, Patricia. I am a certified public accountant and a licensed forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud. I have spent the last 6 months dismantling your entire financial structure piece by piece." I grabbed the 60-page prenuptial agreement in both hands. With one swift motion, I ripped the thick stack of papers right down the middle and tossed the torn halves onto the center of the table. "Your family trust is a giant Ponzi scheme," I said, my voice cold and unwavering. "You are millions of dollars in debt. You are completely bankrupt. And you only wanted my pristine credit score to secure another fraudulent loan so you could keep this ridiculous country club facade alive." The silence that followed my words was heavy and suffocating. Patricia looked like all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. Her blotchy red face turned a sickly shade of gray. Lance was frozen with his mouth open, unable to comprehend that the naive little accountant he had been mocking was actually the architect of their destruction. But Greg was the first to snap. He pushed his heavy mahogany chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. "You are insane!" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of panic and rage. "You are making all of this up." Mr. Harrison read the clauses. "Read the non-disclosure and penalty sections right now. Show this crazy woman what happens when she tries to slander our legacy." Mr. Harrison was visibly trembling. He looked down at the torn halves of the prenuptial agreement scattered across the table. His hands shook so badly he could barely pick up the ripped pages. "Read them," Greg commanded, slamming his fist on the table. The attorney cleared his throat, wiping his sweating forehead with his handkerchief. "Section 18, he began, his voice barely a squeak. Any spouse or prospective spouse who attempts to defame, disparage, or financially sabotage the family trust will be held liable for damages. You will be legally required to surrender all existing personal savings to the trust to cover reputational damage. Furthermore, you will forfeit any future earnings from your career until the debt is satisfied. And if the engagement is terminated due to your hostility, you walk away with $0 and assume liability for the legal fees." It was absolute absurdity. Even after I had just exposed their massive offshore tax fraud and impending bankruptcy, they were still trying to use this garbage legal document to intimidate me. They were completely delusional, trapped in their own bubble of unearned privilege and fake wealth. Greg walked around the table and stood towering over me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out that same heavy gold fountain pen, the luxury pen he had tried to force on me earlier. He clicked the cap off and dropped it right onto my plate next to my untouched steak. "You are going to apologize to my mother," Greg said, his voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. "And then you are going to sit here while Mr. Harrison prints a fresh copy of this agreement. You are going to sign it, and you are going to fix whatever mess you think you found in our accounts. If you do not, I will ruin your life, Nadine. I will drag you through civil court until you are begging for bankruptcy." I stared up at Greg. This was the man I was supposed to marry in 2 months. I looked into his eyes, waiting to feel a shred of heartbreak or sadness, but there was nothing. Only absolute disgust. I did not see a powerful CEO or a loving partner. I saw a pathetic coward who was hiding behind his mother's skirt and a fraudulent trust fund. I picked up the luxury fountain pen. It felt heavy and expensive, probably bought with credit stolen from Jasmine, I thought. I looked at Greg and offered a condescending smile of my own. "You are going to ruin me," I asked softly. "Greg, you do not even have an income." Greg's face flushed purple. "Shut up," he spat. "You have not drawn a legitimate salary in 5 years." I continued, my voice echoing in the large room. "The tech startup you claim to be the CEO of has 0 active clients. It is a shell company used to funnel money from Patricia's offshore accounts back into the United States to avoid federal taxes. Your entire life is a mirage, Greg. Even the Porsche you drove here tonight is not yours. The lease is registered under Jasmine's maiden name. You forged her signature to get the credit approval because your own credit score is in the low 400s. Jasmine gasped aloud. She looked at Lance and then at Greg, her eyes wide with fresh betrayal. "You stole my identity to lease a car," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. Lance suddenly lunged forward. He reached across the table, his large hands grabbing for my phone. "Give me your phone, you little liar," he roared, knocking over a crystal wine decanter. Before his hands could reach me, Jasmine moved. For the first time in 5 years, the silent, obedient shadow finally fought back. She grabbed the neck of the spilled crystal decanter and smashed the heavy base directly down onto the center of the table, right in front of Lance's reaching hands. The loud crack of crystal hitting mahogany stopped him dead in his tracks. "Do not you ever touch her," Jasmine commanded. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was powerful and furious. "And do not you ever lay a hand on me again, Lance. We are done," Patricia shrieked, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. "I am calling the police," she yelled, pointing a shaking manicured finger at me and Jasmine. "I am having you both arrested for corporate espionage and assault. You will spend the rest of your pathetic lives in prison." I smiled coldly. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, heavy dossier stamped with the official seal of the federal government. I slid it across the table until it bumped right against Patricia's empty wine glass. "You do not need to call the police, Patricia," I said, leaning back in my chair, "because the federal authorities are already here." The heavy gold fountain pen lay on the table, gleaming under the crystal chandelier. Greg tapped his index finger against the polished wood, pushing the expensive pen a fraction of an inch closer to my hand. His smile was patient, but it was the kind of patience one might show a slow child who was refusing to eat their vegetables. I did not reach for it. Instead, I placed my own index finger on the smooth gold barrel and slowly pushed the pen away. I slid it back across the mahogany surface until it stopped abruptly against the base of his water glass. I looked directly into his eyes, searching for any trace of the man I thought I knew. "Were the last 3 years just a lie, Greg?" I asked. My voice was steady, but it was loud enough to command the entire room. Every late-night conversation we had about building an equal partnership, every time you told me you admired my independence, my work ethic, and my career. Was it all just a long, carefully calculated con to get me into this chair so I could sign my life away to your mother? The condescending smile vanished from his face. The warmth in his blue eyes, the gentle demeanor I had loved for 36 months evaporated in an instant. It was like watching a completely different person step into his skin. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. "Do not be dramatic, Nadine." Greg sighed, rolling his eyes. "No one is running a con. I am offering you the ultimate privilege of joining one of the most respected families in this city. You get the family name. You get the lifestyle. All we ask in return is your absolute loyalty to the family trust." Loyalty. I repeated, staring at the 60-page legal document resting on my dinner plate. You call surrendering my entire life savings and every future paycheck loyalty. I call it financial abuse. Patricia scoffed loudly, taking a long sip of her red wine. Financial abuse, she mocked, shaking her head. Oh, please spare us the middle-class victim mentality. Greg held up a hand to silence his mother, but his eyes never left mine. His gaze was cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of affection. You need to understand how the real world operates, Nadine, he said, his tone turning incredibly sharp. Families like ours do not just happen by accident. We survive because we consolidate power. We protect our legacy at all costs. And yes, sometimes that legacy requires sacrifices from the lower class. You should be thanking us for this opportunity. Do you have any idea how many women would kill to be sitting in that chair right now? You are incredibly lucky to even be allowed at this table. Sacrifices from the lower class. The words hung in the freezing air of the private dining room like a toxic cloud. I let the phrase repeat in my mind, absorbing the absolute cruelty of it. He was not talking about a marriage. He was talking about a hostile corporate acquisition. I was not a partner to him. I was an asset to be stripped, liquidated, and managed to feed their enormous egos and bank accounts. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who thought they owned me. To my left sat Lance, his face twisted in a smug, arrogant sneer. Beside him was Jasmine. Her eyes were downcast and her hands were trembling violently in her lap as she endured the horrific reminder of her own subjugation. At the head of the table sat Patricia, radiating cold triumph. And directly in front of me sat the man I had planned to spend the rest of my life with, calmly defending the systematic destruction of my independence. I realized in that exact moment that I was completely surrounded by enemies. There was no ally in this room, except for the terrified woman sitting across from me, who had already lost her war 5 years ago. They had brought me here to isolate me. They wanted to overwhelm me with their wealth, their status, and their ruthless attorney, Mr. Harrison, who stood silently in the corner. They expected me to cry. They expected me to fold under the immense pressure of their combined authority. They genuinely thought my middle-class background meant I lacked the spine to stand up to old money. I could see it shining in Patricia's eyes. She was waiting for the tears. She was waiting for the moment my spirit broke, and I picked up that gold pen out of sheer intimidation. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the frantic beating of my heart begin to steady. The initial shock of Greg's betrayal was completely fading away, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I did not feel heartbroken anymore. I felt dangerous. You think I am lucky to be here? I said, my voice dropping to a low, calm register. You think this table is a privilege. Greg narrowed his eyes, sensing the sudden shift in my tone. It is a reality check, Nadine, he stated firmly. Now pick up the pen and sign the document before I lose my patience. I kept my hands resting flat on the mahogany table, completely unmoving. The silence stretched until it became heavy and suffocating. My refusal to break under Greg's glare seemed to irritate the rest of the room. Lance let out a loud, grating laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the dark red wine in his glass. You really think you have leverage here, Nadine, he said, shaking his head in mock pity. You think your little act of defiance makes you strong. You just do not understand how this works. Let me give you a real-world example. He reached out and grabbed Jasmine's shoulder. He did not do it gently. His fingers dug into the fabric of her expensive silk blouse, and he pulled her slightly forward so she was on display for the entire table. Look at my wife. Lance continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. When Jasmine married into this family, she had the exact same stubborn middle-class pride you have right now. She thought she was so special. She had her own architecture firm down in the Loop. She was bringing in decent money, winning a few local design awards. She thought she was going to be the next big independent business owner. Did not you, honey? Jasmine did not answer. She kept her eyes glued to the half-empty water glass in front of her. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Lance tightened his grip on her shoulder. "But Jasmine learned her place," he said proudly, "because a few years ago I made a couple of miscalculations. I put a substantial amount of capital into a commercial real estate development in River North that went completely under. I was over-leveraged and the bank was threatening to seize my personal assets. Now the family trust could have bailed me out, but my mother and I agreed on a better solution." Patricia nodded approvingly from the head of the table. "It was a test of loyalty," she chimed in, taking another sip of her wine. "Exactly," Lance agreed. "So Jasmine did what a good obedient wife is supposed to do. She proved her loyalty. We had Mr. Harrison draft the paperwork and we legally folded her entire architecture firm into the family trust. We liquidated her business, her client list, her office space, and every single penny of her business savings. We used her life's work to pay off my bad debt. And you know what, she did not complain once. She signed the documents and handed it all over because she understands that the family legacy is infinitely more important than some cute little design hobby." My stomach twisted in absolute disgust. He was bragging. He was sitting in a private country club dining room, openly bragging about financially gutting his brilliant, capable wife to cover up his own incompetent mistakes. He had destroyed her career to save his own ego, and he expected me to admire him for it. "Tell her," Jasmine, Lance demanded, giving her shoulder another harsh shake. "Look at Nadine, and tell her how much better your life is now that you do not have to worry about running a business. Tell her how happy you are protecting the family." Jasmine slowly raised her head. She looked at me across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. Her dark eyes were hollow, utterly, completely defeated. For a split second, the polished facade cracked. A single heavy tear escaped from her right eye and rolled slowly down her cheek, leaving a faint track through her flawless makeup. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She just swallowed hard and lowered her head back down, staring at her lap in absolute silence. Seeing that single tear fall changed everything for me. Up until that exact moment, my anger had been entirely self-protective. I was focused on defending myself against Greg's betrayal and Patricia's insults, but watching Jasmine, a woman who was clearly brilliant and talented, sit there as an empty shell of a human being, ignited something completely different inside me. The fear and the shock vanished. The defensive panic I had felt just 10 minutes ago was replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute fury. They had not just brought me here to insult me. They had brought me here to break my spirit and turn me into another Jasmine. They wanted to steal my independence, drain my bank accounts, and force me to sit quietly at fancy dinners while they laughed about ruining my life. I looked at Greg, who was watching me expectantly, waiting for me to yield. Then I looked at Patricia and Lance, who were smiling like they had already won the war. I felt the sharp edges of the weapon I carried. It was not just about saving myself anymore. It was about avenging Jasmine. I felt the sharp edges of the weapon I carried. It was not just about saving myself anymore. It was about avenging Jasmine. Patricia slammed her manicured hand against the table, breaking the tense silence. She was tired of waiting for me to break. The polite society smile completely vanished from her face, leaving behind a cold, ruthless expression. "Are you deaf, Nadine?" Patricia snapped, her voice echoing sharply in the private room. "Or are you just too stupid to understand the position you are in right now? You are sitting there glaring at us like you have some sort of power. You have nothing." Greg leaned forward, sliding the gold pen until it tapped against my plate. "My mother is losing her patience, Nadine. And frankly, so am I. You are embarrassing yourself. You are embarrassing me. Just sign the paper and apologize to Lance, and we can move past this." "And if I do not?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "If I get up and walk out that door right now, what happens, Greg?" Greg did not even hesitate. "Then the wedding is off," he said coldly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The catering, the venue, the floral arrangements. I will cancel everything before you even make it to your car. You can go back to your pathetic little apartment and explain to your bankrupt parents why you ruined the best thing that ever happened to you. I will tell all our mutual friends that you were just a gold digger who got cold feet when asked to prove her loyalty. Patricia was not finished. She stood up, towering over her end of the table, her diamond necklace catching the light from the chandelier overhead. "Oh, it goes much further than a cancelled wedding," she sneered. "You think you can just walk away from this family and go back to your quiet little life? You think you can insult us, waste Mr. Harrison's billable hours, and just go back to your desk job on Monday morning like nothing happened?" I stared at her, letting her talk. "We sit on the charity boards with the senior partners of every major financial firm in Chicago." Patricia continued, her voice dripping with venom. "We play golf with the managing directors. We fund their political campaigns. If you refuse to sign this agreement tonight, I will make one phone call tomorrow morning. Just one. And you will be blacklisted from every accounting firm in this state. You will be fired for fabricated ethical violations, and your professional reputation will be completely destroyed. You will never work in corporate finance again. You will be lucky to find a job ringing up groceries at a local supermarket." The threat was designed to be a kill shot. They were trying to corner me completely. They were holding my heart, my future, and my entire career hostage right there on the mahogany table. I needed a moment. I needed to separate Jasmine from Lance so I could speak to her alone. I also needed to make them believe their threat had worked. They needed to think they had completely broken me so they would drop their guard for my counterattack. I let my eyes widen. I forced my shoulders to drop and I started taking short, shallow breaths. I stared at the 60-page document as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. "Wait," I gasped, letting my voice tremble. "You cannot do that. You cannot take my career." Patricia smiled, a triumphant, nasty smile. "Watch me," she whispered. I pressed my hand to my chest, gripping the fabric of my silk dress. I forced my breathing to become erratic and loud. I let my eyes dart frantically around the room, looking from Greg to Lance to Mr. Harrison. "I cannot breathe," I choked out. "My chest is tight. I cannot breathe." Greg rolled his eyes heavily, sighing in sheer annoyance. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Nadine, stop being so dramatic. Nobody is touching you. Just calm down and sign the document." I ignored him, leaning forward and grabbing the edge of the table. I let my hands shake violently. I reached for my crystal water glass, pretending to aim for a drink to calm my nerves. Instead, I deliberately caught the base of the glass with my knuckles and shoved it hard. The heavy crystal tipped over and crashed onto the mahogany surface. Ice cubes and freezing water spilled everywhere, soaking the pristine white tablecloth and rushing right over the edges of the prenuptial agreement. "Watch what you are doing," Lance shouted, jumping back as the water dripped near his expensive leather shoes. I kept hyperventilating, putting my head between my knees. "I am sorry," I cried out, faking a loud sob. "I am having a panic attack. I cannot breathe." Patricia let out a loud, dramatic groan of absolute disgust. "Good Lord," she muttered, throwing her napkin onto the table. "I cannot stand weak women." "Jasmine, get up right now." Jasmine flinched at the sound of her name. "Take her to the ladies' room," Patricia ordered, waving her hand dismissively in my direction. "Make sure she does not do anything embarrassing in the main dining area. We do not need the country club staff gossiping about a scene. Get her cleaned up, get her breathing back to normal, and bring her back here to sign this document. And tell the waiter to bring Mr. Harrison a dry copy." Jasmine quickly stood up, nodding frantically. She walked over to me, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "Come on," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Let us go. Let us get out of here." I kept my head down, hiding my face as Jasmine pulled me up from the chair. I let my shoulders shake, pretending to cry, as she led me away from the table. As we walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room, I could hear Greg apologizing to his mother for my pathetic behavior. They had no idea I was not panicking at all. I was just setting the stage. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind us, instantly muffling the sound of Greg's cowardly apologies. The hallway of the country club was completely empty. It was lined with dark wood paneling and antique oil paintings of old men who probably hated women just as much as Patricia did. Jasmine kept her iron grip on my arm. She walked fast, almost pulling me along the thick carpet. Her high heels clicked rapidly against the floorboards underneath. She did not look at me. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, scanning the corridor to make sure no one was following us. We reached the ladies' room at the end of the hall. Jasmine pushed open the heavy brass-handled door and dragged me inside. The restroom was overwhelmingly opulent. It had wall-to-wall white marble gold-plated fixtures and an unnecessary velvet lounge chair in the center. Jasmine immediately let go of my arm. She rushed past me and began kicking open every single stall door. She checked all 5 stalls to ensure we were completely alone. Once she was satisfied the bathroom was empty, she ran over to the main door and quickly turned the heavy deadbolt lock. The loud click of the lock echoing in the marble room seemed to act as a release valve for Jasmine. The rigid, obedient posture she had maintained at the dinner table completely vanished. Her shoulders slumped and she leaned back against the locked door, covering her face with both hands. I stopped faking my heavy breathing. I stood up straight, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. I turned to look at Jasmine, ready to drop the act entirely and tell her my plan, but she beat me to it. Jasmine let out a ragged sob. She looked up at me, and her dark eyes were wide with pure terror. "You have to climb out the window, Nadine," she whispered frantically, pointing toward the small frosted glass window above the sinks. "You have to climb out of that window right now, run to your car, and never look back." I frowned, stepping closer to her. "Jasmine, I am fine," I started to say, wanting to reassure her. "No, you are not fine," she interrupted, shaking her head violently. "You do not understand what they are doing to you. This is not just a mean family dinner. This is a financial execution. They are going to trap you. They are going to completely ruin your life." She pushed off the door and paced across the marble floor, her hands trembling as she spoke. "Patricia and Lance are monsters. They find women who have their own money, their own careers, and their own independence. They lure us in with these charming men who pretend to be our equals. Greg is just the bait, Nadine. He is completely controlled by his mother. He does not have a single dime to his name." I watched her carefully, letting her speak. She needed to get this out. She had been carrying this horrific secret for half a decade. "First, they get you to sign the prenuptial agreement," Jasmine explained, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "Then, Mr. Harrison files paperwork moving your assets into a blind trust. You think it is normal wealth management because they act so professional. Then you start getting notices from banks you have never heard of. You ask questions and Lance yells at you. Patricia humiliates you. They isolate you from your friends and your family until the only people you talk to are them. And by the time you realize you are drowning, they already own the life raft." She grabbed my hands, holding them tightly. Her skin was freezing cold. "They are not protecting their wealth, Nadine. They are vampires. They use that document to steal your credit. They will open shell accounts in your name. They will take your pristine credit score and use it to fund their fake billionaire lifestyle. They took everything from me. They even drained my parents' retirement fund to cover a margin call on Patricia's real estate debt." Jasmine choked on a sob, falling to her knees on the cold marble floor. I tried to pull her up, but she refused to move. "I cannot leave them," she cried, her voice echoing off the tile walls. "They threatened to completely destroy my parents financially if I filed for divorce. I am a prisoner, but you still have a chance. You are not legally bound to them yet. You have to run before they turn you into a ghost like me." I knelt down on the marble floor next to her. The absolute agony in her voice cemented my resolve. I had already known the financial facts. I had seen the spreadsheets, the offshore accounts, and the fraudulent tax returns. But seeing the human cost of their crimes, seeing this brilliant black woman reduced to begging on a bathroom floor, made me want to burn the Oak Ridge Country Club straight to the ground. I reached out and gently lifted Jasmine's chin, forcing her to look into my eyes. I was done pretending to be the weak, panicked bride. "Jasmine, listen to me," I said, my voice completely steady and calm. "I am not having a panic attack. I am not hyperventilating, and I am certainly not going to climb out of that frosted glass window." Jasmine stared at me, her dark eyes wide with confusion. The tears stopped falling as she tried to process the sudden change in my demeanor. "You do not understand," she repeated, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You did not hear what I just said. They are going to destroy you." I heard every single word, Jasmine, I replied, keeping my hands firmly on her shoulders to ground her. but you need to tell me exactly how they do it. I need you to explain the mechanics of their tradition. How did Mr. Harrison trap you? Jasmine swallowed hard, looking back toward the locked marble door, as if she expected Patricia to bust through it at any second. She took a deep breath and leaned back against the cold wall. It starts with the document, she explained, her words coming out in a rushed, panicked cadence. The prenuptial agreement is just a smokescreen. It is designed to distract you with outrageous clauses about infidelity and future earnings so you do not notice the fine print about power of attorney. I nodded, encouraging her to keep talking. Power of attorney, I repeated. Yes, Jasmine said, her hands twisting the fabric of her silk skirt. Buried deep in the annex of the agreement is a clause that grants Patricia and Lance full financial power of attorney over your existing assets. They tell you it is just a security measure to protect the family trust from outside litigation. Greg told me the exact same thing 5 years ago. He held my hand and swore it was just legal jargon that would never be enacted. And you signed it? I asked softly. I loved him. Jasmine choked out a fresh wave of agony washing over her face. Lance was so charming back then. He made me feel like I was the center of his universe. He told me his family was just old-fashioned and paranoid about fortune hunters. I had my architecture firm, I had my own money, and I thought my independence would protect me. I signed the paper because I wanted to prove I loved him for who he was, not for his money. She let out a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed in the opulent restroom. I did not know he did not have any money to begin with. None of them do, Nadine. The entire family is a hollow shell. They live off a revolving door of massive corporate debt and fraudulent loans. Jasmine grabbed my forearms, her grip shockingly strong. Once you sign that paper, Mr. Harrison takes over, she continued, her eyes burning with a desperate intensity. He uses the power of attorney to open offshore shell companies in your name. He transfers your personal savings into these untraceable accounts and uses them as collateral to secure high-interest loans. They use your pristine credit score to fund their country club memberships, their luxury car leases, and their designer clothes. But what about your business? I asked, needing to hear the full extent of their crimes. Lance said he liquidated your architecture firm. He did not just liquidate it. Jasmine spat, her voice trembling with pure hatred. He cannibalized it. My firm was winning awards, Nadine. I had a massive commercial contract pending with the city of Chicago. Patricia saw that cash flow and realized it was enough to cover the margin calls on her failing real estate portfolio in Aspen. So Lance came home one night and told me I was neglecting my duties as a wife. He said I was embarrassing the family by working like a common laborer. She wiped her eyes, smudging her mascara across her cheeks. I tried to fight back, she whispered. I tried to hire my own lawyer. But Mr. Harrison had already drained my business accounts. He forged my signature on a series of corporate transfer documents. Overnight, my entire firm was absorbed into their fake trust. When I confronted Lance, he laughed in my face. He told me if I tried to go to the police, he would use his family connections to have my parents audited and completely ruined. He knew my father had a heart condition. He weaponized my love for my family to keep me quiet. They isolate you, Nadine. Jasmine continued, her voice dropping back to a frantic whisper. They make sure you have no friends left to call. They monitor your phone calls and they control your bank accounts so you cannot even afford a taxi to run away. Greg is part of it. He is complicit in every single thing they do. He is sitting out there right now waiting for you to walk back in and hand over your entire life. Jasmine fell silent, her chest heaving as she relived the nightmare. She looked at me with absolute despair. That is their tradition. They are parasites. They find strong, successful women and they bleed them dry to keep their own rotting empire alive. Greg is doing the exact same thing to you right now. He is handing you over to the slaughterhouse. You have to believe me. You cannot go back into that dining room. You have to escape while you still have your own name. Jasmine stopped speaking for a moment and stared at the floor. She took a deep, shuddering breath as if preparing herself for a final act of treason against the family. She unclasped the heavy gold hardware of her designer leather handbag. Her hands were shaking so violently that she fumbled with the zipper inside. I watched her, completely captivated by the raw terror radiating from her every movement. This was not a woman who was simply unhappy in her marriage. This was a hostage preparing to hand over a ransom note. After a few agonizing seconds, Jasmine pulled her hand out of the purse. Her fingers were tightly closed around a small object. She reached out and grabbed my right hand, forcing my palm open. She pressed a cold piece of metal into my skin and folded my fingers over it, holding my fist tightly within both of her hands. I looked down. Peeking out from between my fingers was a small silver USB drive. "Take this," Jasmine whispered, her voice dropping so low I had to lean in to hear her over the hum of the restroom ventilation fan. "I stole it from Lance's home office 2 nights ago." I stared at the silver drive. "You broke into his office?" I asked, keeping my voice equally hushed. Jasmine nodded, her eyes darting toward the locked door again. "Lance keeps a biometric safe in his study. He thinks he is invincible. He thinks I am too stupid and too broken to ever pay attention to what he does." But I watched him. For 6 months, I watched the exact angle of his fingers when he typed in the manual override code. 2 nights ago, when he was passed out drunk after a country club gala, I crept downstairs. I opened the safe, and I copied his master ledgers onto this drive. She squeezed my fist harder, her nails digging into the back of my hand. "Everything is on there, Nadine. Every single forged signature. Every wire transfer routing number. The original incorporation documents for the offshore shell companies they opened in my name. The emails between Mr. Harrison and the Cayman Island bankers. It proves that the family trust is nothing but a fraudulent vehicle designed to steal assets from unsuspecting women." "But Jasmine," I started to say, feeling the immense weight of the small device in my hand. "If you have this proof, why have you not gone to the police? Why have you not taken this to the federal authorities and demanded your life back?" Jasmine let out a hollow, broken sigh. "Because they still hold all the cards," she explained, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. "Mr. Harrison structured the offshore accounts so that legally my name is on the most toxic debt. If I blow the whistle without high-level legal protection, I will be the one taking the fall for federal wire fraud. And worse than that, Lance made it very clear what would happen to my parents. He has their social security numbers. He has their retirement accounts tethered to his banking network. If I try to burn him, he will liquidate my elderly parents' entire life savings with the push of a button before the police even finish taking my statement. I am completely trapped." She stepped back, letting go of my hand. "But you are not trapped, Nadine. You have not signed that prenuptial agreement yet. You have not given Mr. Harrison power of attorney. You are still legally autonomous. You can walk out of here right now and they cannot touch you." Jasmine pointed toward the frosted glass window above the marble sinks. Then she pointed toward the heavy oak door. "Do not go back into the dining room," she pleaded, her voice urgent and desperate. "Walk straight out the front doors of the country club. Do not even wait for the valet to bring your car around. Order a rideshare and get out of this neighborhood. Tomorrow morning, you take that drive to the best corporate lawyer you can find in Chicago. You show them what Greg and his family tried to do to you. Use that information to protect yourself. Build an impenetrable legal wall around your assets so they can never come after you." I looked at the silver drive resting in my palm. The piece of plastic and metal was Jasmine's ultimate act of rebellion. It was her desperate final attempt to save another woman from the exact same living hell she was trapped in. She had risked severe retaliation from a family of sociopaths just to give me a chance at freedom. "They will realize it is missing," I said, looking up at her. "Lance will check his safe eventually. When he sees the drive is gone, he will know it was you." "I do not care anymore," Jasmine whispered, her chin trembling, but her eyes suddenly flashing with a sliver of her former strength. "Let him do his worst. I refused to stand by and watch them destroy another brilliant woman. I could not save myself, Nadine, but I can save you. Just take the drive and run." The sheer bravery of this woman was staggering. She had been beaten down, humiliated, and financially ruined. Yet here she was, risking the little safety she had left to protect a complete stranger. I slowly closed my fingers around the silver USB drive. I felt a profound sense of respect for Jasmine. and I also felt an overwhelming surge of anticipation. I held the small, silver USB drive tightly in my fist, letting its cool metal edge press into my palm. I turned my gaze away from Jasmine and looked directly at my own reflection in the massive gold-framed mirror stretching across the marble wall. The scared, hyperventilating bride was completely gone. I let the fake tears dry on my face. I rolled my shoulders back and stood up to my full height. The trembling in my hands ceased instantly. My breathing slowed to a perfectly rhythmic calm. I smoothed down the front of my silk dress and lifted my chin, letting the cold, calculating part of my brain take over entirely. Jasmine watched this physical transformation happen in real time. She stepped back, leaning heavily against the marble sink, her eyes darting rapidly across my face. She looked deeply confused, as if the panicked woman she had just poured her heart out to had been suddenly replaced by a complete stranger right in front of her eyes. I opened my hand and held the silver drive out toward her. "I do not need it, Jasmine," I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of any fear. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, staring at my outstretched hand but refusing to take the drive back. "You need that proof, Nadine. If you leave without it, it is just your word against theirs. Mr. Harrison will bury you in litigation. They will crush you before you even make it to a courthouse." I shook my head gently. I reached out and placed the silver USB drive firmly on the polished marble counter right next to her designer handbag. "I do not need it because I did not come here tonight to be a victim," I explained quietly. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed the standard lock screen and quickly typed in a complex 12-digit alphanumeric passcode. The screen flashed black for a split second before loading a highly secured encrypted database. I tapped a few folders bypassing firewalls I had set up months ago until a massive, intricate spreadsheet illuminated the screen. I turned the phone around and held it up so Jasmine could see it clearly. "I already have their entire financial history," I told her, my voice echoing cleanly in the quiet restroom. Jasmine leaned in hesitantly. Her dark eyes scanned the glowing screen. She let out a sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth as she instantly recognized the data in front of her. She was looking at the exact routing numbers for Apex Holdings, LLC. She saw the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. She saw the itemized list of every fraudulent loan Lance had taken out over the past 5 years. She even saw the exact dates her own business accounts had been drained. "How do you have this?" she asked, her voice shaking with a completely new kind of shock. "Lance keeps everything totally isolated. Even Mr. Harrison does not have digital access to these specific master ledgers. Lance always bragged that his home network was completely unhackable." I smiled a tight, calculated smile. "They made a fatal mistake, Jasmine. When Greg proposed to me 2 months ago, he asked for my social security number and my personal banking details. He claimed Mr. Harrison needed to run a standard preliminary background check for our joint wedding insurance. He thought I would just hand over my identity like an obedient little future wife without asking a single question." I lowered the phone and locked the screen. But I noticed a strange credit inquiry on my personal file exactly 3 days later. I continued. It was a soft pull from a boutique investment firm located in the Cayman Islands, a firm that legally does not operate within the borders of the United States. Jasmine stared at me, her breathing shallow as she hung on to my every word. "I did not just ignore it," I said, dropping the phone back into my clutch and snapping it shut. I dug into it, and what I found was a massive, intricate web of corporate embezzlement, tax fraud, and predatory wealth extraction. I traced the money from that Cayman Island account straight back to Patricia's failing commercial real estate portfolio. I found the hidden shell companies. I found the forged signatures on your architecture firm liquidation documents. I found the fake auto loans Greg took out using your maiden name. I found every single dirty penny they have moved over the last decade. Jasmine was completely speechless. The sheer magnitude of what I was telling her was washing over her face, replacing her despair with absolute awe. She looked at me not as a helpless trapped bride anymore, but as an apex predator who had just walked willingly into a cage. "You are not a regular tax accountant," she whispered, her eyes wide with realization. "No, Jasmine," I replied, my voice hard and resolute. "I am not." "No, Jasmine," I replied, my voice hard and resolute. "I am not. I'm a forensic accountant. I work for an independent firm that specializes in unraveling high-level corporate embezzlement and offshore tax evasion. My entire career is dedicated to hunting down wealthy criminals who think they are untouchable just because they can afford expensive lawyers like Mr. Harrison. I do not balance spreadsheets for small businesses. I tear down fraudulent empires piece by piece. I use complex algorithms to trace missing money across international borders. I work alongside federal regulators to freeze stolen assets before criminals can even attempt to hide them. Jasmine stood frozen, absorbing the magnitude of my words. She leaned back against the marble sink, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden dawning realization. She realized that Greg had not brought a naive victim into their house. He had brought a bomb. "For the last 6 months, I have treated this family like a federal case study," I explained, keeping my voice calm and methodical. When Greg thought I was working late on client tax returns, I was actually mapping out the entire architecture of the family trust. When he handed over his financial portfolio to impress me early in our relationship, he thought he was showing off his wealth. What he actually handed me was a direct roadmap to his own federal indictment. I took a step closer to her, laying out the entire truth. "I tracked the wire transfers from your architecture firm directly to the Cayman Island shell companies, Jasmine. I matched the exact dates of Patricia's real estate losses in Aspen to the sudden influx of cash from those offshore accounts. I even found the exact forged signatures Lance used to bypass the bank's security protocols when he stole your identity. They thought I was a naive target. They did not realize they had invited a financial apex predator right into their living room." "You planned this," Jasmine whispered in absolute awe, shaking her head slowly. "You came to the country club tonight knowing exactly what Mr. Harrison was going to put on the table. I knew exactly what was in that 60-page document before Mr. Harrison even printed it," I confirmed. "I hacked into his law firm's cloud server 3 weeks ago. I read the drafts. I saw the clauses designed to trap my future earnings and steal my savings. I let them bring me here to this freezing private dining room tonight because I needed them feeling arrogant and untouchable. Criminals always make their biggest mistakes when they think they have already won. By trying to force me to sign that document under extreme duress, they handed me the final piece of physical evidence I needed for a federal extortion charge. But there is one thing I did not account for," I admitted, softening my tone as I looked at her. "I did not know the human cost. I saw the numbers on the screen, but I did not know they had stolen your parents' retirement fund to keep you silent. I did not know the absolute psychological torture Lance put you through. Seeing you in that dining room completely broke my heart, but it also gave me the final piece of the puzzle." Jasmine looked at me, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Can you really stop them?" she asked, her voice trembling with a fiercely burning hope. "Can you really protect my parents? I already have," I told her. 2 days ago, I flagged your parents' retirement accounts through an anonymous regulatory tip. Their assets are currently completely frozen under a federal security hold. Lance cannot touch a single penny of their money. He is permanently locked out of their banking network." Jasmine let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth as a fresh wave of tears hit her. But this time, they were not tears of terror. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. The invisible chains that Lance had wrapped around her neck for 5 years had just been shattered. She let out a shaky breath, laughing softly in the sheer disbelief of her sudden absolute freedom. I reached out and gripped both of her shoulders firmly. "Look at me, Jasmine," I commanded, holding her gaze. "You are a brilliant architect. You built a massive, successful business from the ground up. They tried to break you because they were terrified of your power. But tonight, they are going to learn what happens when you try to trap a woman who knows exactly how to fight back. I need you to walk back into that room with me. I need you to sit next to your husband and watch him lose everything. Follow my lead, I told her, my voice echoing with absolute authority. Tonight we burn their fake empire to the ground and you get your life back. Jasmine wiped the last tear from her cheek. She stood up perfectly straight, fixing her posture. The terrified shadow was gone. The brilliant, successful woman had returned. She nodded once, her jaw set with pure determination. Let us go burn it down, she said. Jasmine unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt of the restroom door and pulled it open. We stepped out of the marble sanctuary and back into the dimly lit carpeted hallway of the country club. The walk back to the private dining room felt completely different this time. 5 minutes ago, I was pretending to be a hyperventilating victim being dragged away from a slaughter. Now we were two women marching back into a war zone with the absolute certainty that we held the nuclear codes. I glanced at Jasmine walking beside me. Her chin was lifted and her shoulders were squared. The trembling shadow Lance had created was dead. We reached the heavy oak double doors. I did not hesitate. I pushed them open and strode confidently back into the freezing private dining room. The polite chatter inside immediately ceased. Everyone turned to look at us. Patricia was leaning back in her chair, holding a fresh glass of red wine. Her face instantly morphed into a mask of smug satisfaction. She took one look at my calm, dry face and clearly assumed Jasmine had successfully coached me into absolute submission. She assumed I had cried my eyes out, accepted my pathetic fate, and returned to the table to officially surrender. Feeling better? Nadine, Patricia asked, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. I do hope you got all of that unnecessary anxiety out of your system. It is so unbecoming for a woman of your age to throw a tantrum in a public place, but we are willing to forgive this little outburst. Just this once. Lance chuckled, a harsh grating sound that echoed across the mahogany table. He did not even look at his wife as she took the empty seat beside him. See, Mother, he said, pointing a silver dinner fork in my direction. I told you she just needed a moment to realize what is at stake. They always come to their senses when they realize they have nowhere else to go. Good job, Jasmine. You finally did something useful tonight. Jasmine did not flinch at his insult. She simply placed her hands elegantly on her lap and stared straight ahead, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Lance was too deeply absorbed in his own arrogance to notice that his wife was no longer vibrating with fear. He was completely blind to the fact that the woman sitting next to him was entirely prepared to watch him go to federal prison. I walked over to my empty chair and sat down. The spilled water from my fake panic attack had already been cleaned up by the country club staff. The wet tablecloth had been expertly covered with a fresh linen runner. Right in the center of my place setting, sitting exactly where my dinner plate used to be, was a brand new, perfectly crisp copy of the 60-page prenuptial agreement. Mr. Harrison stood quietly in the corner of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, looking thoroughly bored with the entire ordeal. Greg leaned toward me. He reached out and gently tapped the thick stack of paper. His eyes were devoid of any real affection, replacing the mask of the loving fiancé with the cold gaze of a corporate manager closing a hostile acquisition. I am glad you calmed down, baby, he murmured, his voice smooth and incredibly patronizing. I knew you were smart enough to make the right choice. Now let us stop wasting Mr. Harrison's expensive billable hours. He picked up the heavy gold fountain pen that had been sitting near his water glass. He uncapped it with a soft click and extended his arm, offering it to me handle first. Sign the back page first, he instructed, pointing to the blank signature line at the bottom of the document. Then you just need to initial the asset forfeiture clauses on pages 12 and 42. After that, we can finally order dessert and celebrate your entry into the family. I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the crisp white pages of the legal document that was designed to completely erase my financial independence. And then I looked around the table. Patricia was watching me like a hawk waiting for the final kill. Lance was smirking, taking another long sip of his wine. Greg was waiting with expectant entitlement. They were all completely relaxed, entirely convinced that the war was over and they had won. I reached out and took the gold fountain pen from Greg's hand. The metal felt heavy and cold against my skin. I shifted my chair forward, pulling myself closer to the mahogany table. I placed my left hand flat on the prenuptial agreement, steadying the thick stack of papers. Then I brought the gold nib of the pen down, hovering it exactly 1 millimeter above the black ink of the signature line. The entire room went dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us. Nobody moved. Nobody took a breath. They were all collectively holding their breath, waiting for the ink to touch the paper, waiting for the exact moment they officially owned my life. I let the absolute silence stretch out for 5 agonizing seconds, letting their anticipation reach its highest possible peak before I completely destroyed it. I lifted the gold fountain pen away from the paper just a fraction of an inch. I did not sign my name. Instead, I used the heavy gold nib to flip the thick, crisp pages of the prenuptial agreement. The sound of the heavy paper turning echoed loudly in the silent room. I flipped past the infidelity clauses, past the alimony waivers, and went straight to the back of the document, to the asset disclosure annex. I found page 42 and smoothed it flat against the mahogany table. I looked up, bypassing Greg and Patricia entirely. I locked my eyes directly on Mr. Harrison, who was still standing in the corner of the private dining room with his arms crossed, looking thoroughly bored. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice polite, but projecting clearly across the large room. "Before I sign this, I have a quick point of clarification regarding the asset forfeiture clauses and the family trust structure." Greg let out a loud, exasperated sigh and dropped his head back against his leather chair. "Nadine, stop stalling," he groaned, his tone thick with annoyance. "Just sign the paper so we can eat. You do not even know what you are reading." I ignored Greg completely, keeping my eyes fixed on the attorney. I tapped the gold pen against Section C of the asset disclosure. "It says here that if I breach the agreement, my personal savings will be transferred into an entity called Apex Holdings, LLC. According to this document, Apex Holdings is a primary subsidiary of the family trust. Could you clarify the operational purpose of this holding company for me?" Mr. Harrison uncrossed his arms and took a slow step forward. He offered a tight, professional smile that did not reach his eyes. "That is standard corporate structuring language, Miss Nadine," he said in a dry, monotone voice. "It is a protective measure for the family legacy, and it does not concern your obligations under this agreement. You do not need to trouble yourself with the complex financial mechanics." I smiled back at him, but my smile was completely cold. I flipped to the next page, running my finger down a long list of subsidiary corporations. "Really?" I asked, looking back up at him. "Because from what I am reading, Apex Holdings LLC is registered in Delaware, but it operates exclusively out of a post office box in the Cayman Islands. Furthermore, it seems to be funneling capital directly into a venture capital fund called Project Obsidian, which is strange considering Project Obsidian has not reported any taxable revenue to the federal government in over 4 years. Mr. Harrison froze. He was in the middle of taking another step toward the table, but his expensive leather shoe stopped dead on the thick carpet. The tight professional smile instantly vanished from his face. His gray eyebrows furrowed in profound confusion, and his eyes widened in sheer panic. I did not stop. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "And as a corporate attorney, Mr. Harrison, I am sure you are aware that legally mandating the transfer of a United States citizen's domestic premarital assets into an offshore shell company without filing a FinCEN Form 114 is a direct violation of federal banking regulations. It is essentially establishing a contractual obligation for international money laundering. So I am just curious how your law firm justifies putting that in writing." The room went entirely, completely still. The arrogant atmosphere that had choked the private dining room evaporated in an instant. Patricia stopped twirling her wineglass. Lance paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. They did not understand the specific legal and financial terminology I was using, but they absolutely recognized the sudden visceral shift in their attorney's demeanor. Greg leaned forward, his face flushing with anger. "You are embarrassing yourself, Nadine," he hissed. "You think throwing around a few terms you Googled makes you look smart? It just makes you look desperate." I caught a glimpse of Jasmine out of the corner of my eye. She was sitting perfectly still, but her hands were no longer tightly clenched in her lap. They were resting flat on the table, and she was watching Mr. Harrison with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. She was witnessing the very man who had engineered her destruction suddenly sweating under the weight of his own crimes. Mr. Harrison was visibly trembling now. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a white handkerchief, dabbing frantically at his forehead. The lawyer looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. He knew that if he tried to defend the clause, he would be admitting to structuring an illegal financial vehicle on the record. If he denied it, he would look incompetent. I had trapped him in an impossible legal paradox right in front of his wealthy clients. "What are you talking about?" Lance demanded, his loud voice breaking the heavy silence. "Stop reading words you do not understand and just sign the paper." Patricia slammed her hand flat onto the table, making the crystal water glasses rattle. "Mr. Harrison, tell this silly girl to stop speaking nonsense and explain the document to her," she ordered sharply. But Mr. Harrison did not move to reassure Patricia. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Ms. Nadine," he stammered, his voice losing all of its previous authority. "I am not sure how a local tax accountant is familiar with international corporate structuring laws, but you are severely misinterpreting these documents." "I am not misinterpreting anything, Mr. Harrison," I replied, my voice steady and completely relentless. "You built a sloppy financial maze because you assumed nobody would ever be smart enough to check your math. But I checked it, and I know exactly what Apex Holdings really is." Lance slammed his fist down on the table, making the silverware rattle against the china. "Shut up!" he roared, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. "I am sick of listening to you run your mouth. You do not know anything about our business. Stop throwing a tantrum, stop stalling, and sign the damn paper right now, or I will personally throw you out of this country club." I did not even look at Lance. I kept my eyes locked on Patricia, who was sitting at the head of the table. Her smug smile was beginning to falter, replaced by a tight, nervous pinch around her lips. Apex Holdings, LLC, was incorporated exactly 4 years and 2 months ago, I said, my voice projecting over Lance's shouting. "It holds an offshore account at the Grand Cayman National Bank. The routing number ends in 4782. Do you want me to give you the full 15-digit account number, Patricia? Because I have it memorized. I also know that as of Tuesday morning, the balance in that primary account was exactly $0.00. Greg let out a nervous scoff, running a trembling hand through his hair. "You are just making up numbers, Nadine," he said, but his voice lacked its previous arrogant bite. It sounded thin and completely reedy. "Am I, Greg?" I asked, turning my piercing gaze to him. "Then let us talk about the secondary account, the one registered under Project Obsidian. That account holds exactly $4.2 million. But that money does not belong to your family trust. It is a commercial bridge loan secured using the stolen assets from Jasmine's architecture firm as collateral. You moved that money offshore to avoid declaring it as domestic income to the federal government. And then you slowly bled it dry month by month to pay the interest on Patricia's underwater commercial real estate portfolio in Aspen." Patricia's face completely drained of color. The deep, expensive tan she maintained year-round suddenly looked like a sickly yellow mask. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked at Mr. Harrison for help, but the attorney was frozen, staring at the thick carpet as if he wished it would swallow him whole. "Let us go a little deeper into the balance sheets." I continued, leaning back in my leather chair and crossing my arms. "You are currently paying $12,000 a month to lease that imported sports car you drove here tonight, Greg. But since your actual income is technically zero, you could not qualify for the lease on your own. So Mr. Harrison drafted a fraudulent power of attorney document, and you forged Jasmine's signature to secure the credit approval. You stole your sister-in-law's identity to fund your fake billionaire lifestyle while simultaneously mocking her at this very table. The smug, confident smiles that had plastered Greg and Patricia's faces just 10 minutes ago were completely gone. They were melting into pure, unadulterated terror. The power dynamic in the private room had shifted so violently and so rapidly that they were physically struggling to comprehend it. They had walked into this dinner expecting to easily bully a naive middle-class accountant into surrendering her life savings. Instead, they were sitting across from a human polygraph who was reading their federal indictments aloud over a dinner of cold Wagyu beef. Lance tried to speak again, but his voice cracked entirely. He looked at Mr. Harrison, his eyes wide with sudden panic. "Tell her she is lying," Lance demanded, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Tell her she does not know what she is talking about. You are our lawyer. Do something about this right now." Mr. Harrison did not say a single word. He just slowly shook his head, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors as if calculating his chances of escaping the building before the authorities arrived. He knew the numbers I was reciting were not guesses. They were exact figures pulled directly from his own encrypted ledgers. "You are bankrupt," I stated plainly, letting the heavy word hang in the freezing air of the dining room. "Your entire family legacy is a carefully constructed mirage built on corporate debt shell companies and stolen credit. You do not have a massive fortune to protect. You are drowning in tens of millions of dollars of toxic liabilities. You did not bring me here tonight to protect your assets from a fortune hunter. You brought me here because my forensic accounting firm is highly profitable and my personal credit score is perfect. You needed a new victim to blindly co-sign your fraudulent loans so the government would not seize your country club memberships and your empty mansions." Greg looked like he was going to be physically sick. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white under the strain. "Nadine, please," he whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic desperation. "Keep your voice down. People outside will hear you. I want them to hear me," I replied, my voice ringing out clear and strong. "I want every single person in this entire building to know exactly what kind of parasites are sitting at this table. You thought you could trap me with a 60-page legal document. You thought you could force me to hand over my career and my independence just to carry your worthless last name." I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen that Greg had tried to force on me. I held it up, letting the crystal chandelier light catch the expensive metal barrel. Then, using both hands, I snapped the pen cleanly in half. Dark blue ink exploded across my fingers and splattered onto the pristine white tablecloth. I dropped the broken pieces of gold directly onto the torn prenuptial agreement. The sharp crack of the thick gold barrel snapping echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Patricia flinched violently as the dark blue ink splattered across the crisp white pages of the legal document. For a second, nobody breathed. Then the absolute shock wore off, and Patricia's sheer panic instantly transformed into a desperate wild rage. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the mahogany table. The crystal water glasses rattled so hard, one of them tipped over, spilling ice across the polished wood. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice entirely losing its refined country club polish and pitching into a hysterical scream. "How dare you sit at my table and spew these ridiculous lies? Who do you think you are? You are nothing but a low-level number cruncher. You balance checkbooks for a living. Tell me right now how you got access to those confidential family accounts before I have Mr. Harrison file a federal lawsuit against you for corporate espionage." I calmly reached for a pristine white linen napkin and began wiping the dark blue ink from my fingers. I did not rush. I let her scream. I let the echo of her hysterical threats bounce off the dark wood-paneled walls of the private dining room. When my hands were clean, I tossed the stained napkin onto the ruined prenuptial agreement. I looked at Patricia and let the final mask drop completely. I am not a local tax preparer, Patricia. I said, my voice icy and completely commanding. My name is Nadine. I am a certified public accountant and a licensed forensic accountant specializing in international corporate fraud and asset recovery. I am the lead investigator for one of the top financial intelligence firms in this country. My entire career is dedicated to dismantling fraudulent empires exactly like yours. Patricia physically recoiled as if I had just slapped her across the face. She sank back into her heavy leather chair, her mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. The predator had just realized she was locked in a cage with the very thing that hunted her kind. Greg looked like he was going to pass out. He grabbed the edge of the table, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You lied to me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You told me you just did basic tax returns. You told me you worked for a small local firm." I looked down at the man I had almost married. "I told you what you needed to hear, Greg," I replied coldly. "Because men like you are terrified of women who are actually smarter than you. You wanted a naive little wife you could control and steal from, so I played the part. I mapped out the entire architecture of your fake trust fund. I traced every single wire transfer. I matched the dates of your mother's real estate losses to the sudden influx of cash from the Cayman Islands." Lance tried to stand up, his massive frame shaking with a mixture of anger and pure fear. "You cannot use any of that," he stammered, pointing a thick finger at me. "That is illegally obtained information. It is inadmissible. You hacked our accounts. You are going to prison, not us." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "I did not hack anything, Lance," I explained, looking at him with pure pity. "Criminals always assume everyone else breaks the law just like they do. I did not need to hack your accounts because Greg handed me the keys." I turned my gaze back to Greg. "2 months ago, when you asked for my social security number to run a background check for our wedding insurance, you thought I would just hand it over blindly. But 3 days later, I noticed a soft credit inquiry on my file from a boutique investment firm in the Cayman Islands, a firm that legally does not operate within the United States." Greg's face drained of all remaining color. He looked at Mr. Harrison, who was now leaning against the wall, looking completely physically ill. "That single credit pull gave me the thread I needed," I continued. "I pulled the public incorporation records. I cross-referenced the registered agents with the board members of your family trust. I tracked the property deeds, the commercial loan filings, and the shell companies you set up using Jasmine's stolen identity. Every single piece of evidence I gathered was obtained through perfectly legal forensic accounting methods. I built a bulletproof federal case against you without breaking a single law." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the mahogany table, completely dominating the space. "You brought me here tonight to humiliate me. You brought me here to legally strip me of my independence and turn me into a financial hostage. You tried to run a corporate con on a woman who writes the textbooks on how to catch corporate cons. The reversal was complete, and it was absolute." I took a deep breath. I reached down and picked up the thick, ink-stained pages of the ruined prenuptial agreement. Gripping the heavy stack in both hands, I ripped it completely in half again. The loud tearing sound pierced the suffocating silence of the private dining room. I tossed the shredded pieces directly onto the center of the mahogany table like a pile of garbage. "Let us talk about the famous family trust, Patricia," I said, my voice cutting through the dead air. "Because it is not a trust at all. It is a Ponzi scheme. A classic textbook Ponzi scheme built on absolute fraud." Patricia stared at the torn pieces of paper, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You do not have generations of wealth sitting in a vault somewhere." I continued, stepping out from behind my chair to command the room. "You have a mountain of toxic liabilities. You take out commercial loans using falsified offshore assets as collateral. When those loans come due, you lack the liquidity to pay them back. So you find a new source of pristine credit to secure a larger loan just to pay off the old one. You keep rolling the debt forward, hoping the music never stops playing. I pointed across the table at Jasmine, who was watching me with fierce, vindicated pride. That is where the spouses come in. First, it was Jasmine's architecture firm. You liquidated her life's work to cover a massive shortfall. That money only bought you a few years of fake luxury. Now the debt has ballooned out of control. You are currently $38 million in the red. The music has stopped playing, Patricia, and there are no chairs left for you. Lance slumped down into his heavy leather chair, his massive frame suddenly looking incredibly small and weak. He rubbed his hands over his face, unable to look at his wife or his mother. "Let us talk about the family mansion," I said, pacing slowly along the edge of the table. "The massive estate on the North Shore with the 10 bedrooms and the indoor pool. The house you love to brag about at all those elite charity galas. It is leveraged to the absolute hilt. You have taken out 4 separate mortgages on that single property, using 3 different shell companies just to hide your total debt-to-income ratio from the primary lender." Greg closed his eyes, tightly gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. "The primary bank issued a final notice of default exactly 3 weeks ago," I revealed, watching Patricia's eyes widen in complete horror. "If you do not come up with a $2 million cash balloon payment by the end of this month, the bank is going to formally foreclose on your precious estate. They are going to send the county sheriff to evict you and throw your expensive designer luggage right onto the street. You are completely bankrupt." I stopped pacing and stood behind Greg, looking down at him. That is why he suddenly rushed the wedding planning and was so desperate to get me to the altar. "You did not want me in this family because you loved me, Greg. You needed my forensic accounting firm. My business generates millions in verified clean domestic revenue every year. I have 0 personal debt and a perfect credit score. Mr. Harrison drafted that garbage prenuptial agreement so he could legally use my firm as a corporate guarantor. You needed my signature tonight to secure a massive new line of credit just to keep the lights on in your mansion. You were going to tether my clean business to your sinking ship and drag me down into federal bankruptcy with you. The sheer audacity of your greed is staggering," I said, shaking my head in disgust. "You believed you could just bully me into handing over the keys to my entire life. You thought I was just some quiet little woman who would be too intimidated by this fancy country club and your fake aristocratic attitudes to actually read the fine print." Patricia finally found her voice, but it was a pathetic, raspy whisper. "What do you want?" she asked, staring up at me with tears of absolute defeat pooling in her eyes. "How much money do you want to keep quiet?" I looked down at her and let out a cold, genuine laugh. "You still do not get it, do you, Patricia? You do not have any money to give me. Everything you own is a total absolute lie. You are a family of highly organized, completely broke criminals. Everything you own is a total absolute lie. You are a family of highly organized, completely broke criminals." Greg's legs completely gave out beneath him. The arrogant, wealthy bachelor who had spent the last 3 years parading me around high society charity galas finally collapsed under the crushing weight of his own massive deception. He dropped heavily to his knees, right there on the thick, expensive carpet of the private dining room. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the floor was the only sound in the room. He scrambled forward, refusing to accept reality. He reached out with trembling hands, grabbing the hem of my silk dress. "Nadine, please," he begged, his voice cracking as tears of sheer panic streamed down his face. "Keep your voice down. The waitstaff is right outside the door. The club manager is out there. If they hear you, we are ruined. My family will be a laughingstock." I looked down at the top of his perfectly styled hair, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust. "You are already ruined, Greg," I told him, stepping backward so his sweaty hands slipped off my dress. "You have been ruined for years. You were just waiting for a new victim to pay the bill." He reached up and grabbed my wrist, holding on like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. "You do not understand," he sobbed frantically, trying to gaslight me one last time. He looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "I did not want to involve you in the family debt. I was trying to fix it. I was trying to secure our future Nadine. Everything I did for us. I wanted to give you the beautiful life you deserve. The big house, the vacations, the security. We can still fix this. We can get married tomorrow. We can consolidate the portfolio together. You are so smart, Nadine. We make a great team. I violently yanked my wrist out of his grip. Do not you ever insult my intelligence again? I snapped, my voice echoing sharply off the dark wood-paneled walls. You did not do a single thing for our future. You did it to maintain your pathetic country club facade. You wanted me to work 80-hour weeks at my forensic accounting firm so you could keep playing golf on Tuesday afternoons and pretending to be a tech visionary. I stepped around him, forcing him to twist awkwardly on the floor, just to look up at me. Let us talk about your visionary tech startup, Greg, I said, folding my arms across my chest. The one you constantly claim is on the verge of revolutionizing the software industry. The one you use to impress my friends. It does not exist. You have exactly 0 clients. You have 0 proprietary technology. You have not drawn a legitimate salary in 5 full years. Greg squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head rapidly as if he could physically block out the sound of my voice. Please stop, he whispered, hiding his face. I will not stop, I replied, my tone hard and unyielding. You stand around at cocktail parties swirling expensive scotch, bragging about being a self-made CEO, but your entire life is completely subsidized by stolen money. You are a 35-year-old man who receives a monthly allowance from a bankrupt trust fund. And when your mother could not afford your allowance anymore, you turned to outright theft. I pointed across the room toward Jasmine, who was watching Greg squirm on the floor with an expression of pure, justified vindication. You could not even afford the car you drove here tonight, I said, reminding the entire room of his ultimate betrayal. You valeted a $200,000 sports car at the front entrance tonight just to impress the valet drivers and the other club members, but that Porsche is leased under Jasmine's maiden name. I wanted to twist the knife, making sure he knew exactly how pathetic he truly was. You forged your own sister-in-law's signature on the dealership paperwork because your personal credit score is in the low 400s. You are completely unbankable, Greg. No legitimate financial institution would lend you the money to buy a used bicycle, let alone a luxury imported vehicle. So you stole the identity of a brilliant woman your family had already psychologically destroyed. Greg let out a pathetic whimpering sound, burying his face in his hands. He was curled up on the carpet, a completely broken shell of the confident man who had arrogantly handed me a gold pen just 20 minutes ago. You are not a partner, Greg, I told him, looking down at his sobbing form. You are not a provider. You are a parasite. You actively sought out a successful, independent woman so you could attach yourself to my bank accounts and drain my life savings. You looked me in the eyes and told me you loved me while you were secretly plotting to legally bind me to $38 million of your mother's toxic commercial real estate debt. He slowly lowered his hands, looking up at me with red, puffy eyes and a tear-stained face. I love you, he choked out, his voice pathetic and incredibly weak. I really do love you, Nadine. I stared at him, letting a cold, dead silence stretch between us for a long, agonizing moment. No, Greg, I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. You just loved my credit score. No, Greg, I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. You just loved my credit score. Greg slumped forward, completely defeated, pressing his forehead against the carpet. The room was heavy with the finality of my words. But the absolute quiet was suddenly shattered by a violent roar from the other side of the table. Lance had been sitting in stunned silence, watching his younger brother beg on the floor. But the reality of his own impending federal indictment finally snapped his fragile ego in half. He realized that the digital files I had on my phone, the encrypted ledgers, and the offshore routing numbers were the only things standing between him and a decade in a federal penitentiary. His arrogant mind convinced him that if he could just physically destroy my device, he could somehow erase his crimes. "Give me your phone, you little liar!" Lance bellowed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He pushed his heavy mahogany dining chair back so forcefully that it tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. He did not bother walking around the long table. Instead, he planted his hands on the polished surface and lunged his massive frame entirely across the table. His expensive leather shoes scrambled for traction as he reached his thick hands directly toward my clutch where I had placed my phone. He knocked over plates and sent silver cutlery clattering to the floor. I did not flinch. I did not even take a step back. I knew exactly what kind of coward he was. But before Lance's grasping fingers could even reach the edge of my clutch, a sudden blur of motion erupted to my left. Jasmine moved with a speed and ferocity that absolutely no one in that room could have ever predicted. The silent, obedient shadow who had sat trembling just an hour ago had completely vanished. 5 years of suppressed rage, 5 years of financial abuse and psychological torture suddenly detonated all at once. She reached out and grabbed the neck of the heavy crystal wine decanter sitting near the centerpiece. It was still half full of dark vintage red wine. She hoisted the heavy crystal high into the air. Lance did not even have time to register what his wife was doing before Jasmine brought the decanter crashing down with terrifying force directly onto the mahogany table right in front of his reaching hands. The sound of the thick crystal shattering was deafening. Shards of glass exploded in every direction. Dark red wine blasted across the pristine white tablecloth, spraying over Lance's expensive tailored suit jacket and dripping onto his face like blood. Lance let out a sharp yell of shock, violently jerking his hands back away from the jagged broken glass. He stumbled backward off the table, losing his footing and crashing hard into the wall behind him. He looked down at his ruined suit and then up at his wife, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. Jasmine stood tall at the edge of the table. Her posture was completely transformed. She held the broken, jagged neck of the crystal decanter in her right hand, her knuckles white from her iron grip. Her chest was heaving, but her dark eyes were blazing with a powerful, unyielding fire. She was no longer the victim. She was a warrior who had just broken her chains. "Do not you ever touch her!" Jasmine commanded, her voice echoing with an absolute chilling authority that froze the entire room. "And do not you ever lay a hand on me again." Lance pressed his back flat against the dark wood-paneled wall. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. "Jasmine," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively, terrified of the sharp crystal weapon in her hand. "Have you lost your mind? Put that down. You are my wife. You do what I say. I am not your wife anymore." Jasmine fired back, stepping forward and pointing the jagged glass directly at him. "I am the woman you stole from. I am the woman you isolated and threatened. But you do not have any leverage left, Lance. Your mother is bankrupt. Your brother is a fraud. And you are going to federal prison." She tossed the broken neck of the decanter onto the ruined table. The heavy glass clattered loudly against the fine china. "You thought you could hold my parents' retirement fund over my head forever." Jasmine continued, her voice radiating pure vindication. "You thought I would just sit here and let you destroy another brilliant woman because I was too scared to fight back. But Nadine already secured my parents' money. They are protected by a federal security hold. You cannot touch them. You cannot touch me. You have absolutely nothing left." Lance looked like he had been physically gutted. The realization that he had lost his ultimate bargaining chip completely drained the remaining fight out of him. He looked at Patricia, who was sitting frozen in her chair, too terrified to even speak. He looked at Greg, still sobbing on the floor. Jasmine picked up her designer leather handbag from the chair. She did not look at Lance with anger anymore. She looked at him with profound, overwhelming pity. "I am leaving you, Lance," she stated, her voice calm and resolute. "I am walking out of this country club, and I am never coming back. My lawyers will contact you tomorrow morning. And trust me, I am taking back every single penny you stole from my firm." She turned her back on him, completely dismissing his entire existence. She walked over to where I was standing and stood shoulder to shoulder with me. We looked at the ruins of the fake billionaire family scattered around the private dining room. The predator had been entirely defanged, and the hostages were finally walking free. The predator had been entirely defanged, and the hostages were finally walking free. But Patricia was not ready to surrender. Having just watched her golden child son sob on the carpet and her eldest son get completely neutralized by his own wife, Patricia finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The absolute reality of losing her massive mansion, her elite country club status, and her freedom violently collided in her brain. She pushed herself up from her heavy leather chair. Her hands were trembling so violently that her expensive diamond rings clinked sharply against the polished mahogany table. "You think this is over?" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, terrifying register that echoed wildly in the destroyed private dining room. "You think you can just march in here, spout a few complicated accounting terms, and tear my family apart? I will completely destroy you, Nadine." Patricia pointed a shaking manicured finger at my face. "I will hire the most ruthless corporate litigators in the entire state of Illinois. I will sue your firm into the ground for defamation, corporate espionage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I will drag your name through the mud until you are bankrupt and begging to settle out of court. You will never work in this city again." I did not flinch at her screaming. I simply smiled. It was a cold, calculated, and completely unapologetic smile. That single expression seemed to drain the remaining venom right out of Patricia's throat. She stopped screaming mid-sentence, her chest heaving as she stared at me, waiting for my counterattack. I slowly reached down to my professional leather tote bag resting on the floor beside my chair. I deliberately unzipped the main compartment, taking my time. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was thick-bound with a tamper-proof red string and prominently stamped with the official seal of the United States federal government. I held the dossier up for a moment, letting the bright light from the crystal chandelier illuminate the bold black government lettering on the front cover. Then, with a quick flick of my wrist, I slid the heavy package straight down the center of the long mahogany table. It glided smoothly over the ruined white tablecloth, sliding right past the broken pieces of the gold fountain pen, and stopped just inches away from Patricia's trembling hands. Patricia stared down at the thick envelope as if it were a live explosive device. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice suddenly sounding incredibly small and fragile. "That is your future, Patricia," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. "That is a copy of a comprehensive 200-page forensic audit detailing every single instance of wire fraud, tax evasion, and identity theft your family trust has committed over the last decade. It includes all the Cayman Island routing numbers, the forged power of attorney documents, and the complete digital footprint of every fraudulent commercial loan you used to keep your fake aristocratic lifestyle afloat. It is everything." Mr. Harrison suddenly stepped forward from his corner, his eyes completely locked onto the government stamp on the envelope. "You cannot legally use any of that." The lawyer stammered, his voice shaking with desperation. "We will file an immediate injunction first thing tomorrow morning. We will suppress that evidence in a civil court before it ever reaches a federal judge. You violated client confidentiality." I let out a soft, genuine laugh, shaking my head at his sheer professional incompetence. "You cannot file an injunction against a document that has already been processed and verified." "Mr. Harrison," I explained, leaning forward and resting my hands firmly on the table. I looked directly into Patricia's terrified eyes. "I did not bring that dossier here tonight as a threat to extort you, Patricia. I brought it as a courtesy receipt. I officially submitted the original encrypted copy of that exact report to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service exactly 48 hours ago." The entire room seemed to stop spinning. Greg stopped crying and looked up from the floor. Lance froze against the wall. "The federal authorities have already verified the offshore accounts. I continued, delivering the final killing blow. "They have already issued warrants to freeze your primary domestic assets. The commercial banks have already been notified of the fraud. You cannot sue me to stop a federal investigation that is already actively concluding." The absolute finality of my words struck the room like a physical shockwave. Patricia's knees completely buckled beneath her. She collapsed back into her heavy leather chair, her eyes wide with unadulterated absolute horror. The checkmate was completely locked in. There were no more moves left on the board. The fake empire was officially dead. I stood at the edge of the mahogany table watching the absolute devastation wash over the room. The silence was thick and suffocating. It was not the arrogant silence they had used to intimidate me earlier in the evening. This was the silence of total defeat. Patricia was staring blankly at the thick government-stamped dossier, her chest barely moving. Greg was still slumped on the floor, his tears completely dried up, replaced by a hollow, catatonic stare. Lance remained pinned against the wall, looking like a terrified child who had just been caught stealing. And Mr. Harrison, the ruthless corporate attorney, was physically shaking. He knew better than anyone else in that room what a federal indictment actually meant. His career, his law license, and his freedom were all entirely over. I looked down at the shredded pieces of the prenuptial agreement scattered across the white linen tablecloth. "You really thought you had everything perfectly calculated," I said, my voice breaking the heavy quiet. "You thought you could just snap your fingers and absorb my entire life into your fraudulent trust. You looked at my successful accounting firm, my perfect credit score, and my personal savings, and you saw nothing but a lifeline. You wanted to take every single penny I had ever earned, just to buy yourselves a few more months of fake luxury." I walked slowly around the ruined table, my high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor beneath the thick carpet. "But your arrogance blinded you to a very specific detail about federal tax law." I continued, keeping my eyes locked on Patricia. "When you operate a financial scheme of this magnitude, you leave a massive digital footprint. And when that footprint involves tens of millions of dollars of untaxed offshore assets, the United States government gets very interested." I stopped pacing and stood right next to Patricia's chair. "Have any of you ever heard of Section 7623 of the Internal Revenue Code?" I asked. Nobody answered. They were all too paralyzed by fear to even speak. "I did not expect you to," I said, offering a cold smile. "But Mr. Harrison should definitely know it. Section 7623 is the IRS whistleblower program. It is a specific federal statute designed to incentivize financial professionals to expose massive corporate tax evasion. The law states that if an individual provides the federal government with actionable evidence of tax fraud exceeding $2 million, that individual is legally entitled to a substantial financial reward." Patricia's eyes slowly darted up to meet mine. The complete confusion in her expression was slowly being replaced by a new, terrifying realization. She was finally starting to understand the true depth of my counterattack. The federal government does not just offer a simple pat on the back for uncovering a massive international financial crime. I explained, my voice steady and unwavering. They offer a percentage of the total recovered assets. Depending on the quality of the evidence provided, the whistleblower is legally entitled to anywhere between 15 and 30% of the collected proceeds. I leaned down, placing both of my hands on the arms of Patricia's heavy leather chair, trapping her in her seat. I brought my face down until I was looking directly into her wide, terrified eyes. "Over the last decade, your family trust has illegally shielded exactly $40 million from federal taxation," I said, enunciating every single word with absolute precision. "You funneled it through Apex Holdings, LLC, and hid it in the Grand Cayman National Bank. But because I handed the Internal Revenue Service a perfectly documented, 200-page forensic audit, they do not have to spend years investigating you. They already have the wire transfers, the forged signatures, and the fake commercial loan applications. My evidence was so comprehensive and so flawless that I was immediately approved for the maximum reward tier." I stood back up, smoothing out my silk dress. 30% of $40 million, I stated, letting the math hang in the freezing air of the private dining room. Jasmine let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. Even she had not fully anticipated the magnitude of the trap I had set. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every single one of them. "You brought me here tonight to steal my life savings," I said, delivering the final killing blow. "You wanted my savings. I just made $12 million off your arrogance." You could hear a pin drop. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical weight that completely crushed the remaining air out of the room. Patricia let out a faint wheezing sound, clutching her chest, as if her heart had just physically stopped beating. Greg buried his face in his hands again, letting out a pathetic, completely broken sob. Lance slid slowly down the dark wood-paneled wall until he was sitting flat on the floor, his massive frame entirely defeated. They were not just going to federal prison. They were going to finance my entire future. The predators had completely funded the prey. Patricia broke the silence first. The absolute catatonic shock that had frozen her to her leather chair suddenly shattered, replaced by the frantic adrenaline of a trapped animal. She lunged forward, her manicured hands scrambling across the ruined mahogany table. She ignored the shredded pieces of the prenuptial agreement and the spilled red wine, completely bypassing her sobbing son on the floor. She grabbed her diamond-encrusted smartphone and her designer leather handbag, holding them tightly against her chest. "I have to make a call," Patricia stammered, her voice breathless and wildly erratic. "I have to call the offshore managers. If I can just get them on the phone before the banks close the international portals, we can wire the remaining balance into a blind shell. We can still hide the primary equity." Mr. Harrison pushed himself off the wood-paneled wall, his face completely pale. "Do not do that," Patricia the lawyer pleaded, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "If the Internal Revenue Service has already issued the freeze warrants, moving those funds now constitutes active obstruction of justice. You will elevate this from a white-collar financial crime to a direct federal felony. Put the phone down." But Patricia was completely beyond reason. The arrogant matriarch who had spent the last hour demanding my total submission was now operating on pure panicked instinct. She refused to lose her massive mansion. She refused to let the country club elite see her dragged down into bankruptcy. "Shut up, you incompetent fool!" Patricia shrieked at the attorney. "You told me this trust structure was bulletproof. You told me we were untouchable. I am not going to sit here and let some middle-class accountant steal my legacy. I am calling the bankers right now." She turned on her expensive heels and practically sprinted toward the heavy oak double doors of the private dining room. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the brass handles. She shoved her shoulder against the thick wood, throwing the doors wide open and stepping out into the carpeted hallway of the country club, but she did not make it past the threshold. Patricia collided chest first with a solid wall of dark navy blue Kevlar. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of her lungs, sending her stumbling backward right back into the dining room. Her designer handbag slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Her diamond-encrusted smartphone clattered across the hardwood, spinning out of reach. Standing directly outside the doors, completely blocking the exit, were 4 heavily armed federal agents. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their chests. Their hands were resting firmly on their tactical belts, and their expressions were completely devoid of any sympathy. Flanking the armed agents stood 2 men in sharp gray suits. One of them held a thick leather binder, while the other had a gold badge clipped prominently to his belt. The badge clearly identified him as a lead investigator for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The sudden terrifying presence of federal law enforcement officers entirely suffocated the remaining oxygen in the room. Greg let out a pathetic squeak, scrambling backward on his hands and knees until his back hit the edge of the mahogany table. Lance, who had been sitting defeated on the floor, suddenly threw his hands up into the air in a gesture of complete panicked surrender, even though no one had spoken to him yet. The lead IRS agent stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the freezing private dining room. 2 of the FBI agents followed him immediately, fanning out to secure the perimeter and ensure nobody made a sudden move toward the windows. The agent's eyes swept over the shattered crystal decanter, the spilled wine, and the shredded legal documents covering the mahogany table. Finally, his gaze locked directly onto the terrified woman stumbling backward away from him. "Patricia?" he asked, his voice projecting with absolute, unquestionable federal authority. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest. She tried to pull herself up straight, attempting to summon whatever remaining country club privilege she had left. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she demanded, her voice shaking violently. "You cannot just barge into a private dining room at the Oak Ridge Country Club. We are legacy members here. I want your badge number, and I want to speak to your superior immediately." The lead investigator did not even blink. He opened his thick leather binder, pulling out a stack of legally binding federal warrants. "We know exactly who you are, Mom," he replied, his tone flat and entirely unimpressed. "And we have already spoken to the club management. They are currently clearing the main dining hall to ensure a smooth transition for your departure." I watched the entire scene unfold from the far end of the table, standing shoulder to shoulder with Jasmine. I had not just submitted the forensic audit 2 days ago. I had actively coordinated with the lead federal prosecutor assigned to the case. I gave them the exact time and location of this dinner. I knew Patricia would try to flee or move the money the second she realized the trap had been sprung, so I made absolutely sure the federal raid was scheduled to execute the moment I delivered the checkmate. The timing was utterly flawless. The timing was utterly flawless. The lead investigator from the Internal Revenue Service stepped fully into the room, his sharp gray suit a stark contrast to the heavy tactical gear of the federal agents flanking him. He looked down at Patricia, who was still gasping for air against the heavy oak doors. "Patricia," he said, his voice carrying the absolute crushing weight of the United States government, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, international tax evasion, and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia completely snapped. The polished, aristocratic matriarch instantly dissolved into a thrashing, desperate woman. "Get your hands off me," she screamed, as an agent firmly grabbed her arm and spun her around. "You cannot do this. I am a Platinum Legacy member here. I demand to call the club president. I demand to speak to the mayor. We fund his re-election campaigns." The federal agents did not care about her golf handicap or her political donations. They pinned her arms behind her back, and the cold, heavy click of steel handcuffs echoed sharply in the silent room. Patricia let out a loud, sobbing wail, her expensive diamond bracelets scraping against the unforgiving metal cuffs. 2 other agents marched straight past the shattered crystal decanter and hauled Lance up from the floor. Lance's massive frame offered absolutely no physical resistance. His legs were completely like jelly. "Wait," he pleaded, his voice cracking as the agents violently yanked his arms behind his back. "Jasmine, tell them I was just following my mother's orders. Jasmine, please, you have to help me. I am your husband." Jasmine stood right next to me, her posture completely straight and her expression entirely unreadable. She looked at the man who had stolen her business, ruined her credit, and threatened her elderly parents. "You are not my husband, Lance," she replied, her voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "You are just a criminal who finally got caught." The click of Lance's handcuffs seemed to act as a starter pistol for Mr. Harrison. The ruthless corporate attorney who had stood silently in the corner, arrogantly threatening to ruin my life just moments ago, suddenly threw his own clients completely under the bus. "I knew nothing," Mr. Harrison shouted, raising his hands high into the air and backing away from the mahogany table. "I am simply retained legal counsel. I acted strictly on the information provided to me by Patricia and Lance. They lied to me. They provided falsified financial disclosures. I had absolutely no knowledge of the offshore accounts or the forged signatures." The lead investigator slowly turned to look at the sweating lawyer. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his leather binder and held it up. "Save it for the judge counselor," the investigator said, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "We have the encrypted emails between your personal law firm server and the Cayman Island bankers. We also have a separate federal warrant for your immediate arrest regarding the facilitation of international money laundering. Put your hands behind your back right now." Mr. Harrison's face drained of its remaining color. He let out a pathetic, whimpering sound as an agent forcefully spun him around and cuffed him. The architect of the fake empire was going down right alongside his wealthy patrons. "Stand them up and move them out," the lead investigator ordered, gesturing toward the hallway. The agents grabbed Patricia Lance and Mr. Harrison roughly by the arms and began marching them out of the private dining room. Jasmine and I followed closely behind, watching the ultimate destruction of their carefully curated reality. As we stepped out of the hallway and entered the main dining hall of the country club, the atmosphere was completely electric. The federal agents had ordered the management to keep the patrons in their seats, but word had clearly already spread. The massive room filled with the wealthiest elites of Chicago was entirely silent. Dozens of influential politicians, corporate executives, and high society socialites sat frozen at their tables. They watched in absolute, stunned disbelief as Patricia, the woman who had spent decades looking down her nose at everyone else, was paraded through the room in shiny steel handcuffs. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her hair was completely disheveled. Her mascara was running down her face in thick black streaks. Lance walked behind her, his head hung so low his chin touched his chest, hiding his face from the people he had spent years trying to impress. The gasps rippled through the dining hall. I heard the sharp whispers of country club members as they pointed at the disgraced family. The social facade they had sacrificed Jasmine's career and attempted to sacrifice my future to maintain was entirely shattered. They were no longer the elite, untouchable billionaires of the North Shore. They were just common thieves doing the public perp walk past the expensive dessert cart. Patricia looked up through her tear-streaked face and made eye contact with a prominent charity board member she had desperately tried to impress for years. The board member immediately looked away, raising her wine glass to hide her face in pure second-hand embarrassment. That single moment of public humiliation broke Patricia more completely than the prospect of federal prison ever could. She let out a guttural sob, her legs giving out again, forcing the agents to physically drag her the rest of the way across the carpeted floor. Her expensive leather handbag and the illusion of her aristocratic legacy were left completely abandoned. I stood near the entrance of the dining room with Jasmine, watching the heavy glass doors of the country club swing shut behind them. The red and blue flashing lights of the police cruisers waiting outside illuminated the dark Chicago night, casting long shadows across the marble lobby. I turned away from the heavy glass doors of the country club lobby. The flashing red and blue police lights slowly faded into the distance as the federal cruisers drove away, carrying the architects of my attempted destruction. The chaos that had just ripped through the elite establishment was finally settling into a heavy, stunned silence. I looked at Jasmine, who was standing perfectly still beside me. We did not need to say a single word to each other. We both knew there was exactly one piece of garbage left to take out. We turned around and walked slowly back across the main dining hall. The wealthy patrons watched us pass, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer respect. The sea of elite Chicago socialites literally parted for us as we made our way back to the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. I pushed the doors open and stepped back into the freezing room. The space looked like the site of a violent corporate explosion. The pristine white tablecloth was completely ruined, stained with dark red wine, and covered in shards of broken crystal. The 60-page prenuptial agreement lay shredded in the center of the mahogany table. And sitting right in the middle of the wreckage, completely alone, was Greg. He had not moved from the floor. He was slumped against the base of the table, his expensive tailored suit wrinkled and stained. When he heard our footsteps, he slowly raised his head. His eyes were red and swollen, and his perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. He looked absolutely pathetic. The arrogant tech visionary who had demanded my absolute loyalty just an hour ago was now nothing more than a terrified boy who had just watched his allowance get entirely confiscated by the federal government. "Nadine," he whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. He clumsily scrambled to his feet, leaning heavily against the ruined table for support. Nadine, please listen to me. I stopped a few feet away from him, folding my arms across my chest. I let him speak, giving him enough rope to hang himself one last time. It is over, he pleaded, holding his hands out toward me in a desperate begging gesture. My mother is gone. Lance is gone. It is just us now, Nadine. I can change. I swear to you, I can change. I did not want to do any of this. They forced me into it. They told me if I did not get you to sign that document, they would cut me out of the family completely. But I am free now. We can start over. We can build a real life together. I will get a real job. I will be the husband you deserve. I stared at him, feeling a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. He was not mourning the fact that his mother had just been dragged away in handcuffs. He was not apologizing to Jasmine for stealing her identity. He was simply trying to secure a new host. He was a parasite desperately trying to reattach himself before he completely starved to death. You really are a coward, Greg. I said, my voice flat and entirely devoid of any pity. You are perfectly willing to throw your own family under the bus the second it benefits you. You do not want a fresh start. You want me to pay your rent next month. I reached down and grabbed my left hand. I gripped the massive engagement ring he had placed on my finger 2 months ago. The ring he claimed was a priceless family heirloom passed down from his wealthy grandmother. I slid the heavy metal over my knuckle and pulled it completely off. I walked over to the mahogany table and picked up his heavy crystal glass. It still held 2 fingers of his 18-year-old scotch. I held the engagement ring directly over the glass. Keep it, I said, dropping the ring. It hit the expensive amber liquid with a soft clink, sinking straight to the bottom of the glass. It is a cubic zirconia anyway, I told him, watching his jaw drop in absolute shock. Did you really think I would not check? I had it appraised the morning after you proposed. It is worth exactly $400. Finding out my billionaire fiancé gave me a piece of polished glass was the very first red flag that made me look into your offshore accounts. A real forensic accountant always verifies the assets. Greg stared at the fake diamond resting at the bottom of his scotch glass, completely paralyzed by the realization that I had known he was a fraud from the very beginning. I had played him flawlessly. Jasmine stepped up beside me. She looked at Greg, her dark eyes filled with nothing but cold indifference. Have a nice life, Greg, she said, her voice perfectly calm. Try to find a job that does not require a background check. Jasmine reached out and wrapped her arm firmly through mine. We did not look back. We linked arms and walked out of the ruined dining room, leaving Greg sobbing alone in the wreckage of his fake empire. We walked out the front doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The valet rushed forward to ask if we needed our cars, but we waved him off. We walked down the sweeping driveway together, our high heels clicking in unison against the pavement. The cool autumn wind swept off Lake Michigan, blowing away the suffocating stench of the family. Jasmine and I walked into the night not as victims, but as the architects of our own absolute freedom. 6 months have passed since Jasmine and I walked into that crisp autumn night as the architects of our own absolute freedom. The fallout from that dinner at the Oak Ridge Country Club was completely biblical. The federal government did not just freeze the family trust, they entirely dismantled it brick by fraudulent brick. Jasmine filed for divorce the very next morning. Armed with the encrypted ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of identity theft, her legal team completely steamrolled Lance in civil court. He did not even have the funds to hire a private defense attorney and had to sit in the courtroom relying on a completely overwhelmed public defender. I was there the day the judge finalized the divorce. Lance could not even look Jasmine in the eye. Thanks to the federal security holds and the immediate asset seizures, every single penny they stole from her architecture firm was fully restored with interest. Last week, she sent me a picture of herself standing in front of a massive commercial building in the Loop, holding the keys to her reopened firm. Her parents' retirement accounts remain completely untouched and secure. She is finally living the brilliant, successful life she always deserved, free from the parasitic chains of her former in-laws. As for me, I am currently sitting on the plush velvet sofa of my brand new penthouse overlooking the gorgeous Chicago skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows let in the bright morning light, illuminating a space that is entirely mine. I paid for it completely in cash. Hanging on the wall directly across from me in a sleek custom frame is a replica of the massive bounty check I received from the Internal Revenue Service. 30% of $40 million. It is a daily physical reminder that knowing your own worth and standing your ground can quite literally pay off. I take a slow sip of my coffee and glance at the flat-screen television mounted above my modern fireplace. The local morning news is playing a live broadcast from the steps of the federal courthouse downtown. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen reads, "North Shore Elite Sentenced in Massive Fraud Scheme." I watch as Patricia and Greg are escorted out of the courthouse doors by armed United States Marshals. They look completely unrecognizable. The designer suits and expensive diamond jewelry are gone, replaced by standard-issue prison uniforms and heavy steel chains. Patricia looks haggard, her posture completely broken, her fake aristocratic pride utterly shattered by the reality of a concrete cell. Greg is trailing behind her, crying as the news cameras flash in his face. Their trial concluded yesterday. Without their expensive lawyers and their stolen credit, they immediately collapsed under the crushing weight of the federal evidence. Patricia was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Greg, who spent his entire testimony trying to blame his mother, received 8 years for aggravated identity theft and corporate embezzlement. Lance received 10 years. Their massive North Shore mansion was seized and auctioned off by the bank to cover a fraction of their massive debts. They thought they could use my love and my hard-earned success as a weapon against me. They assumed my middle-class background made me an easy, naive target for their aristocratic con game. They expected me to shrink to doubt myself and to hand over the keys to my entire life just to secure a seat at their toxic dinner table. But they forgot one absolutely crucial detail. You can never break a woman who built her own table. Do not ever let anyone determine your worth based on their own toxic insecurities or their fake prestige. Whether it is an arrogant partner, a manipulative mother-in-law, or an entire family trying to force you into submission, you have to establish fierce, unyielding boundaries. When people show you exactly who they are and try to diminish your value, you must believe them the very first time. Protect your peace, protect your finances, and never be afraid to burn down a fake empire to save yourself. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship, or if you have survived a family that tried to tear you down and steal your light, I want to hear from you. Please share your own survival stories in the comments section below. Hit the like button and subscribe to my channel to join a powerful community of people who refuse to be victims. Thank you so much for watching, and always remember that the absolute best revenge is your own undeniable success. Stay strong and know your value. The power of uncompromising boundaries. The gripping story of Nadine dismantling a corrupt, parasitic family serves as a powerful masterclass in a vital life lesson. Your independence, both financial and emotional, is your absolute greatest armor. Society often conditions us to be intimidated by perceived prestige, wealth, or the alluring facade of elite status. Nadine's fiancé and his family weaponized this exact illusion, assuming her middle-class background would make her desperate enough for their approval to blindly sign away her hard-earned life savings. However, Nadine's triumph demonstrates that true power does not reside in a country club membership, a leased sports car, or a prestigious last name. It lies in self-reliance, financial literacy, and the uncompromising refusal to let others dictate your value. By meticulously verifying the facts and refusing to be gaslit by Greg's sudden panic or Patricia's aristocratic intimidation, Nadine protected not only her own future, but also liberated Jasmine from years of silent abuse. The toxic family relied on isolation and the illusion of superiority to enforce their compliance. Nadine shattered this dynamic entirely by trusting her own instincts, leveraging her professional expertise, and maintaining impenetrable personal boundaries. This narrative serves as a stark reminder that predators often disguise themselves as loving partners or welcoming families, seeking out strong, successful individuals, not to support them, but to extract their hard-earned resources. We must remain vigilant and never compromise our autonomy for the sake of keeping the peace or fitting into a toxic dynamic. Instead of paying an exorbitant price just to secure a seat at someone else's table, we must focus on building our own. Take a moment today to fiercely evaluate your own financial boundaries and boldly share your personal stories of overcoming manipulation in the comments below.